Good morning. We would like you to address a very important topic, information. There are two more people that are going to join us, two journalists. I would like to thank Agnese Pini, director of Nazione, Il Resto del Carlino, Il Telegrafo, and the whole QN group. On my left, another well-known personality from the world of information, especially when it comes to artificial intelligence and the green economy. And Ricardo, I think you're going to tell us which one is your preferred, which is the one you preferred. Director of Talented, the Portal for Technology and Innovation, La Repubblica and La Stampa. Gil Guersani is also coming. There he is, president of the Geopolitical Study Institute. Welcome, please. Now we're waiting for another guest, the Chairman Global Creative of Dentsu, Gordon Bowen, but we are going to start anyway. So the main topic of this panel is the right to transparency. We know that papers, magazines, sometimes have to abide by a number of rules if they don't publish a certain piece of news. I don't know if this is transparency, and the same is true for commercials, for advertisement, sometimes misleading. So let's try to take stock of the situation and maybe come up with a few suggestions. Pope Benedict and Pope Francis both said, by expressing the same concept, that we had to clean up the air we're breathing, so purify it from its pollution. So let's start from you, Agnese, 5 minutes each. Then we're going to take a few questions. And at 4:20, 4:25, we're going to conclude. Well, you talked about purifying. Well, it's a great word. It has a lot to do with information, especially when there's an objective, extraordinary, epoch-making industrial crisis of the information of the world of information. What we are experiencing is not a crisis of the world of information as such, because you are the most informed generation. Because information has never been so accessible and so free in most cases. Information was something that was limited to the elites, especially before the introduction of the smartphones. To find information, you had to switch on a television, so you needed to have a TV set or switch on a radio or buy a paper and pay for that. So it was an elite access to information. Now it's a mass access to information. So it's an extraordinary revolution that caused a crisis for the industries producing information. So the industry behind papers, which is a production activity like any other else, cannot be self-sustained any longer, because the industry supporting it is actually undergoing a crisis that began back in 2004. When I talk about the information in general, I'm referring to the printed press. So it's been 20 years now that there has been a constant decline in the circulation of written papers and magazines. So 2014, then post-COVID, well, the very last years have further exacerbated the whole scenario. So what it is causing? Well, this is causing the weakness of the industries producing information. So as a spillover, an extreme weakness, political weakness as well for journalists, for editors-in-chief that basically have lost their power, a power that was actually in their hands, now is in the hands of their readers, so they have less power than what I had 20 years ago. So anything say now can actually be challenged by you. You just have to Google it, and you couldn't do it 20 years ago. This is positive, of course, but it's also negative, because losing power means that we've got a more limited contractual capacity, especially when it comes to market-related questions, so advertisement and policy making. And this is very topical, not because policymakers are mean. We've got less power. We've got less power to put up with the requests of policymakers. And this is a big democratic question. And I will conclude here, Father Enzo. I wanted to maybe point out something obvious, that maybe it is not that obvious. Information is the only guarantee to the sustainability of a democratic system. There's no democracy without information, because information is the only filtered system between the communication of those in power and the people. Information is the filtering system between the heads of state, the leaders, speaking through social networks or from their offices, and you. So without this filtering system, there's no democracy. When we talk about purifying information from its pollution, we are talking about a problem of democracy with a capital D. Thank you, Agnese. Well, I'm sure that it is important to point out something very important. So papers become a sort of productive activity. So they end becoming part of consumerism. So if a piece of news is useful, or if it's not useful, and not if it is useful for democracy, then we're going to go back on this. Ricardo.
No, sorry, there is no microphone. You should turn on the microphone. The microphone is not on. His microphone. Could you tell the speaker to kindly put on the microphone? I'm sorry, the interpreters are sorry, but we can't hear what is being said. His microphone is now. When we write something on Repubblica newspaper, when we write something about John Elkann and Exor, we say that that's the owner of the newspaper. So that is something that international press used to say. Well, since sort of Elkann is in control of the group, of the Espresso Repubblica group. But when we talk about the right to information, we're talking about the right that we have to know who was asking to reform a law of access to the acts of public administration. Is something which is to be found everywhere in the world, and especially in the United States. And we need to have something tantamount to the Freedom of Information Act. In other words, we must be informed about what the public administration does. So when a decision is being made by the public administration, we should be informed ourselves. We have a legitimate right to be informed, but every citizen, and journalists in particular, have a right to ask the public administration to provide us with the information. So we were able to discover a number of things in Italy thanks to the Freedom of Information Act. For instance, the gifts were given by the Prime Minister's office. We discovered who gave those gifts, and we have sort of discovered how the latest sort of financing tranche of the PNRR, the Resiliency Pact, were being distributed. So the public administration is under the obligation to provide the material and the relevant information. And this is extremely important for citizens in general and journalists in particular. Well, citizens are less capable of acting in this respect, but journalists are doing this all the time. Well, reference was being made in the past about the pandemic scheme that Italy was supposed to adopt prior to the discovery of the vaccine. So as I said, this is a key instrument. And so we have this right to transparency, which is protected by law. Is this something which is being fulfilled and complied with? No, not all the time. But to some extent, is that happens in Italy, not just in Italy. The most important point which I was able to sort of do in my life was to the State Department in the United States about an Italian case, which is a very important case. Well, the student, Giulio Regeni, was killed in Cairo mysteriously. He was well, there was a trial which was being started. Then at some point, the New York Times tells the story about Giulio Regeni, and the Italian government had been informed earlier and knew a number of things. And since the Italian government claimed that they didn't know anything, I have sort of used the Freedom of Information Act in my request to the Department of State. Why I didn't get an answer from the Italian government, since there was no reason why they shouldn't let me know about this, what has happened. So every year, I have sort of requested the same information, and every year I get an answer saying you're on the wait list. They don't tell me you can't get the information you are requesting. I know that sooner or later they will give me this information. Despite this injustice, which is a clear injustice, because they do have the information, but they don't want to uncover what's in those documents. Well, we do have, as journalists, a key instrument for the control of public administration. If the government has some documents which are of concern to us and relevant to us, sooner or later they will let us know about this. So we want to make sure that we keep fighting to ensure that we do have such a right and we can exercise such a right. So we discovered something new, that we know where the source of information is, whom we should address when it comes to news which are being sort of banned and not uncovered. Well, I don't know. Well, there are a number of reasons behind the non-disclosure of some information. Let's carry on this very topic. It is the right to transparency. What can we learn on that with respect to France? The young journalists in France, or young entrepreneurs in France who have great experience, well, they can let us know something. Thank you for this invitation, Father. I'm happy to speak after my colleagues, because they said something that I had in mind about the transparency. You focused on the most important aspect. Transparency is equivalent to mediation, so there is a limitation in the word transparency. Transparency is mostly something which can interpret what is happening, providing an interpretation about what is happening. And that is one of the key issues. The fundamental crisis of traditional media today is due to the fact that they have been replaced they're increasingly being replaced by a kind of ideology that says, well, it's too much. That we need to have a more direct access. And this, as a result, may have exactly the opposite result. We still need this kind of mediation, and especially at a time which is so filled with tensions. We should do what historic magazines do. Well, you work with what is happening at the academic level, and also you refer to a public debate. This is especially important today. We've been considering for 20 years now that we are going through a profound transition period with very the cardinal referred that we are on the verge of the end of specific times. So, well, this is something that we all feel. Well, either over the last 20 years or in a cyclical manner, we do address a number of key issues for our life. Every 2-3 years, experts that write papers that are part of the talk shows, maybe epidemiologists, experts of terrorism. So we have the impression that at the end of the day, we're always lagging behind with respect to the crisis which is breaking out. It's not just a crisis in terms of access to information, but it's related on our mediation, how we tell, what's the narration about what is happening. Everything is increasingly more mediated by the transparency of social media. They say, well, what is it that you need to have? So the social media result into a fragmentation of the general picture. And this gives us the impression that we are living in a world where fake news are all over the place, and the different truths do not seem to be easy to reconcile. So in conclusion, what's this kind of assumption that we can make to try and sort of be effective in this respect? Technically speaking, what we try is to ensure that we sort of consult persons that have a conscience, a more profound conscience of the crisis. Well, when the crisis breaks out, well, you have no time to do research into the ground, the core elements of the crisis. We need to sort of the media that have a role. They need to sort of ensure that their knowledge can be made available so that it is very relevant to what is happening. And then there is something else which happens. There is sort of immediate reactions with respect to fake news. We can claim, well, all we have to do is to do fact-checking. And so we sort of can do away with this. Well, there is a very strong image, which is a kind of a myth. When the first meeting between Khrushchev and Nixon in '59 in Washington, at some point during the discussion, Khrushchev said to Nixon, when your people is convinced that there is an imaginary river, well, you shouldn't convince them. You have to build an imaginary bridge on this imaginary river. So what we lose sight of is not just the fact that there is manipulation or ideology, but we should try and understand why so many people seem to be convinced that fake news are the actual telling us the actual reality. And that is the sort of problems that we're all up against in the various, in the public debate and the public arena. Thank you for your comments.
I'm thinking about the peaks of crisis, like the Cardinal said. While you were making your comments, I thought about the dialogue with Khrushchev and Nixon. I was wondering what's imaginary. For example, about the church, you might imagine lots of things. You might build lots of things, either good or bad. Like the reality of consumerism that shows us this happiness that actually never comes. So I don't really know what happiness bridge one might build, you know. In Italy, there's always this imaginary image of a bridge. I won't go into the details, obviously. It's just an example of making it also to be provocative somehow. Let's go back to you, Agnese. We are here in a pretty peculiar place because Michelangelo expressed the biggest protest against the right to transparency by painting nudes in the Sistine Chapel. It would be interesting to read the reports of the time, the Vatican reports, but also other reports. That was an example of great communication, a communication that is still here. It's a language that is still spoken. It is still very powerful. So the final judgment is still impressive in this regard. But what are we lacking to have something permanent, something that is not ephemeral? Well, that's a tricky question. It's a question for all of you that I will try to answer your question. You know, I mean, there are special effects, but there's no proper word. Well, I will start from the final judgment and the choice of painting nudes. What are usually journalists asked to do? They are asked to tell the truth. So you journalists must tell the truth, must expose the nudity of information. We are in a holy place, the holy place par excellence. So I'm thinking of what Father Giovanni, or what actually was said about truth. Truth makes you free. And this is an ambition that journalists have. So democracy goes hand in hand with freedom, and the freedom of journalists is actually to help citizens be free to maybe cast a vote, having the right information available. If we talk about truth of journalism, we have to ask ourselves, though, how can we actually tell the truth? And it can't be done through the creative power of art, like Michelangelo did, or the truth of faith, a truth that makes us free. It can't be that way. We see it every day, also with wars. I was really scared when COVID broke out, because when a global pandemic breaks out that had no precedents, the questions asked by citizens were to tell the truth, to know the truth. And no one had the right instruments to tell the truth about something that had no precedence. So we basically turned to distinguished or reliable sources. No one had the truth to share because no one knew anything about the virus, how the virus was going to spread, how to stop the virus. So we had a big problem with truth. We all challenged ourselves. You were challenging us because you were telling us we were not telling the truth. We were very limited in our ability of telling the truth. There's just one way through which journalists can bypass this terrible risk that might translate into pushing reality, pushing truth, which is not what we are doing. I would recommend that you read a collection of reports that dates back to 1956. Montanelli was a special envoy of Corriere della Sera to Budapest. It was invaded by Russian tanks. The tanks had just entered the city, so Montanelli couldn't work his job. He had to stay in the hotel. All the international journalists had to stay indoors. Montanelli, anyway, was forced to write a piece because the paper had to publish something. And he wrote a beautiful piece about truth, another important way of interpreting the truth. And he wrote, confined in a hotel room because Russian tanks have entered the city and anyone can go out. Anyone, no one saw anything. So I'm just going to tell you about what I saw, and I apologize if it is not going to be much. It's just like Jesus, who said, go and see for yourselves. This is what journalists do. The humble truth is our truth. It's a truth that must turn into honesty. When they try to push truth with a capital T, they make terrible mistakes. The only truth we can cherish is the truth to go there and see and tell about what we see. That is our truth, and we apologize if that is not much to you. Thank you very much. The humble truth. That's very interesting. I agree with Agnese. The most honest thing, the best thing we could do is even say what we don't know rather than make up truths that might suit you. What Agnese says is the starting point, is the basic foundation of our job. What Montanelli wrote is what I draw inspiration every day. Whereas with respect to the concept of truth, I have a few doubts because there's no just one truth. There's an interpretation of facts that we give every day. There's a hierarchy that is difficult every day and is difficult depending on our way of looking at the world, depending on our values. And luckily, this is different from person to person and differs greatly. Well, every day things happen that prove this. The other day I wrote something about what Mattarella said, the president of the Italian Republic. So he attended the General Assembly of the UN and he delivered a beautiful speech on peace, wars, multilateralism, etc. So it was an important thing, basically, to report about. And he said, I would like to refer to what the Secretary General of the UN said, and I'm asking for no military intervention in Rafah. That will be a terrible problem for Palestinian civilians. Well, I know that I'm saying something that is causing a rift in the public, but Mattarella's words would have been reported by half of the Italian papers. Gaza, Mattarella's warning. Every time our president says something, it's commonly referred to as a warning. Or maybe Mattarella warns Netanyahu, anything anyway, but the president of the Italian Republic in New York at the UN General Assembly saying no to the military intervention in Rafah, saying yes to the aids of the UN agency that Israel accused of actually being an accomplice to Hamas. Well, those words were hardly reported in the press. So not because they were censored, but because in the interpretation of the world given by the current editors of the papers, it doesn't really fit, it doesn't work. So if Mattarella talks about magistrates, well, yes, his words are going to be reported. He says something against the military intervention in Rafah, not even a word, not even a line. This question of the interpretation of facts happens every day, and I'm saying this because there's not just one truth. There are lots of facts. Obama once said that we are all entitled to our own interpretation, but we are not entitled to our own facts. A thing is either happened or not. Whatever you might believe, what happened on the 7th of October, it actually happened. The bloodshed happened. Well, the interpretation of why this happened might vary, and this varies every day. And it's here that journalists and editors step in saying, what's the meaning of this? How important is this? What news am I going to deliver? What I'm going to publish on the first page? Otherwise, we would have just one paper. This depends on our values. This depends on our way of looking at the world. So truth is a fundamental value to defend. Democracy is a fundamental value to defend. But we have to bear in mind that what we are talking about is just a piece of truth. It's a piece of our truth, and we have to compare views with those of others. Of course, I'm buying a paper, I will read about my truth, but then luckily there are social networks showing many other things. The biggest part of the information I got from what is happening in Gaza, I got it from Instagram or from TikTok, not because there's Hamas behind them, but because there are people sending pictures, sending videos, and publishing them on these social networks. And the reason for which many young people are occupying universities, and traditional papers say they are crazy. We told about what's happening. Why are they occupying universities? Well, a few days ago, a beautiful article was published about the students that are actually occupying the universities, and someone went to talk to the students at Columbia University and asked them, why are they occupying universities? And they answered, because they can't stand what's happening. And they knew about what's happening through the social media, unfortunately. I'm saying unfortunately because I work for a paper, but maybe a tad more we could have done to tell about what's happening, even if it's not our view of the world. But anyway, they got this information. There are young people here at the Eurovision that retrieved this information somewhere else and formed another interpretation of what's happening, and they behave accordingly. Thank you, Riccardo.
I don't know whether we can sort of refer to what you said, applying it to transparency when you try to get information through Instagram. That shows that everyone is sort of greatly interested in getting information, and that makes all the difference. This brings us back to the same original idea. If you think there's an imaginary river, oh, there must be somewhere. So I agree on the fact that the question of truth is something else. You have philosophical truth that doesn't find any particular coverage in the press. Because it's something that must be corrected and negotiated. So I agree with Agnese. If we could claim that we can say the truth, say the real truth, the authentic truth, that you wouldn't work as a journalist. The most important thing about the truth is in the gospel when Pontius Pilate asks Jesus, what is the truth? And waits for the answer. to take up the provocative comments of the father on the nudes in Michelangelo's Sixtine Chapel, I'll go back to this fundamental issue. It's true that there are so many sources you can draw from, but there is a principle for filtering, screening the various sources, and this requires the role of a specific institution to do that. The times we're going through now, which is a time of fragmentation, destruction, where the political aspect is being sort of denied. The only thing that can help us deal with the crisis is that we have institutions that will know how to handle this situation and take up the challenges. Institutions that should be opening them up to new sources of information. Well, the nudes of Michelangelo are not something that you've come across very often, but they are sort of there in the church in a special position. They are part of the institution, so you need institutions that must be clever and understand what's the time we're going through now. So we have to sort of behave differently when we are confronted with this. We should understand that this is a very serious problem which exists in Europe. If in Europe the great sort of newspapers, the leading journalists are less relevant, are weaker, it's not that we are going to live in a better world. So we just will be deprived of any mediation, which is essential. How can you strengthen the institution? That's strategically very important. I know that in Italy, this is heresy, but there are kinds of possibilities based on public funding for this purpose. Well, aqueducts that provide water to your homes and the roads, they have been funded not on the basis of market considerations, but they must be at some point dealing with sort of market rationale. And but the ideology of transparency at all costs has somehow been affecting the foundations of the institutional media. There were a number of controversies. Well, the fact that we do not need transparency because everyone has got access to the information. And this is very dangerous because you might create a world where, and this gives us the impression that we are living in a world where fake news are all over the place, and the different truths do not seem to be easy to reconcile. So in conclusion, what's a kind of assumption that we can make to try and sort of be effective in this respect? Technically speaking, what we try is to ensure that we sort of consult persons that have a conscience, a more profound conscience of the crisis. Well, when the crisis breaks out, well, you have no time to do research into the ground, the core elements of the crisis. We need to sort of the media that have a role. They need to sort of ensure that their knowledge can be made available so that it is very relevant to what is happening. And then there is something else which happens. There is sort of immediate reactions with respect to fake news. We can claim, well, all we have to do is to do fact-checking. And so we sort of can do away with this. Well, there is a very strong image, which is a kind of a myth. When the first meeting between Khrushchev and Nixon in '59 in Washington. At some point during the discussion, Khrushchev said to Nixon, when your people is convinced that there is an imaginary river, well, you shouldn't convince them. You have to build an imaginary bridge on this imaginary river. So what we lose sight of is not just the fact that there is manipulation or ideology, but we should try and understand why so many people seem to be convinced that fake news are the actual telling us the actual reality. And that is the sort of problems that we're all up against in the various, in the public debate and the public arena. Thank you for your comments.
I'm thinking about the peaks of crisis, like the Cardinal said. While you were making your comments, I thought about the dialogue with Khrushchev and Nixon. I was wondering what's imaginary. For example, about the church, you might imagine lots of things. You might build lots of things, either good or bad. Like the reality of consumerism that shows us this happiness that actually never comes. So I don't really know what happiness bridge one might build, you know. In Italy, there's always this imaginary image of a bridge. I won't go into the details, obviously. It's just an example of making it also to be provocative somehow. Let's go back to you, Agnese. We are here in a pretty peculiar place because Michelangelo expressed the biggest protest against the right to transparency by painting nudes in the Sistine Chapel. It would be interesting to read the reports of the time, the Vatican reports, but also other reports. That was an example of great communication, a communication that is still here. It's a language that is still spoken. It is still very powerful. So the final judgment is still impressive in this regard. But what are we lacking to have something permanent, something that is not ephemeral? Well, that's a tricky question. It's a question for all of you that I will try to answer your question. You know, I mean, there are special effects, but there's no proper word. Well, I will start from the final judgment and the choice of painting nudes. What are usually journalists asked to do? They are asked to tell the truth. So you journalists must tell the truth, must expose the nudity of information. We are in a holy place, the holy place par excellence. So I'm thinking of what Father Giovanni, or what actually was said about truth. Truth makes you free. And this is an ambition that journalists have. So democracy goes hand in hand with freedom, and the freedom of journalists is actually to help citizens be free to maybe cast a vote, having the right information available. If we talk about truth of journalism, we have to ask ourselves, though, how can we actually tell the truth? and it can't be done through the creative power of art, like Michelangelo did, or the truth of faith, a truth that makes us free. It can't be that way. We see it every day, also with wars.